Hey everyone, I'm Alex from Cytonox, and today I'll be ranking the dungeons of Ocarina of Time from worst to best. Ocarina of Time is the darling of the series and just about everybody's favorite if you ask them. It's like my third favorite probably, but I can totally get why people regard it as highly as they do, and I certainly love it more than most games out there. It was one of the first games I ever ranked as a kid, the other being Shovel Knight, which I somehow still haven't covered in the channel yet. When I replayed the game, I was shocked to find that my opinions were the exact same as my 11-year-old self. Guess I always had good taste. Anyways, that's enough reminiscing. It's almost time to cut to the meat of the video and talk dungeons. Just before we do that though, I'd like to thank our patrons. We really appreciate your support, and for those of you watching, do consider joining them. Enough intro stuff, let's get into it. I do not know what on earth inspired the creation of this dungeon. With any normal development team, the question, do you want to be inside of Jabu Jabu, would have been met with a swift no. And yet, here we are. If nothing else, I applaud the art direction here. As an appreciator of all things bizarre and grotesque, the setting is right up my alley, and for a game made half a decade before I was conceived, they sure made the aesthetic better than pretty much anything ever made sense. Of all the inside some creature's guts levels I can recall, none of them are quite as viscerally unpleasant looking as this one. Something about the moving pink sludge, abundance of tentacles and bizarre creatures, and sound design make this a uniquely disgusting experience. Once the mystique of the creative environment wears off, though, you come to realize that it is not the belly of a whale you have wandered into, but rather the 9 circles of hell. While the first 2 child dungeons merely commit the sin of being easy to the point of being relentlessly uninteresting, inside Jabu Jabu's belly is upfront and in your face about how much it hates you. Every aspect of the level design is transparently sadistic, from the random sinkholes to the confusing, samey-looking rooms. It even has elevator placement that would make Kakihara from Ichi the Killer kneel in admiration. I'd also like to call attention to the big Octo mini-boss, which I have always found to be a baffling and unintuitive fight. With how gimmicky Zelda bosses usually are with their weaknesses, who the hell would ever try something as brazen as just running around the middle to flank him? That's like if you were given a math test and the answer was to just rip it to shreds, piss on it, and jam it down the teacher's throat. Nothing indicates that this is a viable strategy, leading many players, myself included, to humiliating and infuriating deaths at the hands of this wicked creature. Enjoy slogging back through half an hour's worth of hallways made of the stuff McNuggets are made out of. Make sure not to lose Ruto on the way. Yeah, I never mentioned that, did I? You have to carry Nintendo's second most obnoxious assisting NPC in history around everywhere, using her as a weighted tool to open doors or whatever. If you leave her to her own devices, even for a moment, she gets dragged down to Jabu Jabu's bottom floor bash for you to pick up at whatever the opposite of your leisure is. Whenever you do decide to bite the bullet and give her another piggyback ride to a tumor switch, she has nothing but words of scorn for you. Link is quite the gentleman for a kid his age. My 10-year-old self would have left her to drown in digestive juice and bile if she gave me that kind of lip. Your reward for enduring approximately an hour of eyeball-gouging, torturous gameplay is the most confusing boss in the series. I'll save my full thoughts on Baronade for the boss ranking, but just know that for better or worse, this boss makes no fucking sense to me. Whatever feelings of pride the developers may hold towards this dungeon have to be analogous to how Jigsaw regards his traps, finely tuned mechanisms of torment that nobody but the creator finds amusing. I have similar thoughts on all the Ganon's Towers of the series in a general sense, but for the record, this one is miles more tolerable than the one from Wind Waker. More than unpleasant, they're mostly just lazy. They rehash old dungeon concepts but remix them into the most irritating imaginable arrangements. Yeah, the Shadow Temple is cool, but do you know what it was missing? Likes, apparently, if you wanted the developer's professional opinion. Nothing quite like getting your gear slurped off to put you in a good mood. Don't even get me started on the Fire Temple room. Having to restart the coin collecting thing every time you fall into the lava sounds fair enough until you realize that this will happen, like, a lot. Unless you have the mental fortitude of a monk, this room will be among the most trying of your patience of any in the game. The ice room is just a boring puzzle about shoving some giant ice block around. These are the sorts of things they use in nursing homes to amuse senile hospice patients with nothing better to do than shit themselves and watch Jeopardy reruns. For anyone cogent of the passing of time, this will strike you more as a time-consuming bore than a titillating mind teaser. I could go one by one moaning about the rooms, but it doesn't really matter beyond just giving a few examples. Some are fine, some are miserable, all of them are unoriginal padding with zero amusement value. Young Link sure went inside a lot of things, didn't he? Poor kid, no wonder he never talks. Better than the opposite, I suppose. This dungeon is the break-even point of the video, where the dungeons go from affronts to mankind to simply average. I don't really have any issues with the Great Deku Tree from an objective standpoint. It's the first dungeon, so the difficulty is about what you'd expect, and it's at least got some cool moments like jumping down into the basement for the first time. It's also fairly quick if you know what to do. I wasn't speedrunning or anything, but it still took me around 20 minutes to get through. The spiders are sort of a pain in the ass, but most of the damage I suffered at their hand was out of impatient negligence on my part more than anything else, so I can't in good faith give him the finger. The slingshot is definitely the most fun Kid Link dungeon item in my opinion, or at least the most broadly useful. This dungeon establishing Deku shrubs as fully sentient beings is sort of funny, considering how many of the things Link has unceremoniously put to the sword over the years. My best guess is that they're somehow socially divided between civilized and savage ones, although whether or not that renders one worthy of slaughter is up for debate. The video game ethics rabbit hole runs deep, but the same cannot be said of this unremarkably quaint dungeon, leaving it in the lower ranks of the pack. Not even halfway through the video and all the Kid Link dungeons are already out of the running. Ocarina of Time has a strange way of organizing its content for sure. Historically, it's far more common for a game to have a strong first half and a severe drop in quality around the midpoint. I'd point you to Dark Souls 1 as the poster child, but the same trend is observable to lesser extents in a number of other games. Ocarina of Time, however, is the type of game that saves best for last. This is a far more effective model since it minimizes player disappointment. By all means, get me accustomed to the boring fodder dungeons before unleashing the crazy bullshit in Phase 2. I have similar thoughts on Dodongo's Cavern and the Great Deku Tree. Both are perfectly serviceable dungeons with little in the way of memorable moments, but Dodongo's Cavern wins out for a couple reasons. For one, dropping bombs into giant eye sockets is cool as shit. It makes perfect sense from the perspective of a player versed in video game logic, but I like to imagine Link just being like, dude, what if I put a bomb here, and then being surprised it actually did something. I will say that the bombs as a whole are sort of a mediocre item in my eyes. Despite their destructive potential, they're almost never used in combat to much effect save for vaporizing Stalfos, and instead are basically a demolition tool for rocks and whatnot. A lot of people don't realize just how big of a deal being able to detonate bombs at will in Breath of the Wild was. That's honestly one of the biggest quality of life changes they made. Waiting for bombs to explode doesn't take a while individually, but the time spent watching paint dry adds up over the course of a whole playthrough. Not much else to discuss. The setting is sorta cool, although it feels like a fire temple light once you've experienced the Big Kahuna. The Zalfos are also neat. I always liked fighting them in this game much more than in any of the other ones. Very average dungeon, comparable to eating a piece of bread without butter or jam. The Water Temple is notorious for being bullshit levels of hard, which definitely hurts it to some extent, but there are a couple reasons that I don't necessarily hate it like some people do. For one, it's way less frustrating in its difficulty than Jabu Jabu's wretched stomach. In that dungeon, the difficulty came from stuff like having to pick up Ruto or navigate hard to differentiate rooms. Here, it's all about awareness. As I've stated in many of the past dungeon ranking videos, the best dungeons are usually ones that require you to think on two levels. How do I solve this room, and how does this one room fit into the grander puzzle of solving the whole dungeon? It makes you think a lot more about where stuff is, how to get where you need to, and stuff like that. This is the sort of challenge that I think dungeons ought to have, although there are still issues with the Water Temple for sure. For one, the way keys are handled here is atrocious. Ocarina of Time dungeons in general have a problem with this, but two in particular really shit the bed on this front. There must have been at least 2 times where I make it to the end of a room only to realize I need a key to progress. This is annoying in any dungeon given it demands you backtrack everywhere and scrounge around for it, but doubly so in the Water Temple. This is because of the water level mechanic, which requires you to go to certain rooms to adjust which rooms are accessible based on how much is underwater. While I like that this provided the aforementioned feeling of the dungeon being one large cohesive puzzle rather than a series of single room puzzles, it makes backtracking a logistical nightmare. Just for a mere chance at finding a key, you must do the entire dungeon backwards multiple times over, which is a lot like finding hay in a used needle stack. The iron boots being handled as they were is just the cherry on top of this shit sundae. I don't find it as horrible as a lot of people seem to, but it's definitely a nuisance having to poke around in the menu every time I realize I forgot my keys in the dragon statue room or whatever. When you aren't aimlessly roaming around hunting for keys or watching Link sink down with his cement shoes, this dungeon is actually pretty cool though. The hookshot is my favorite item in the series, and it's always great getting use out of it. The music is interesting also. The Water Temple has this strange feel to it that a lot of the better dungeons in older games have. I wouldn't say any of the modern dungeons quite have it, except for the city in the sky. The whole Dark Link segment is a great example of this. You fight him in this bizarre open room that appears to go on forever in every direction. No explanation is ever given as to what he is or where you are, and nothing overtly obvious seems to kill him. Best mini-boss in the game. I love this guy. While the Water Temple has surely extracted enough tears from players to fill its volume many times over, I can't help but have some amount of grudging respect for it all the same. Believe it or not, deciding whether to rank the Forest or Water Temple higher was the hardest choice of this video for me. They have very similar pros and cons, possessing some of the best atmospheres in the series but suffering from bullshit key hunting slogs and other issues. A lot of the puzzles in this dungeon are the boring, drawn-out block-pushing ones, which for some reason Nintendo seems to think people actually enjoy. You don't even think for this one, they literally give you arrows telling you where they go. It's just a pointless 5 minutes taken out of your day to watch Link develop a hernia. There's also the Floor Masters who kick you back to the start of the dungeon and make you go all the way through again because why the fuck not? What were they thinking when they made these? It's not like the NES era where games had to have bullshit so you took more than half an hour to beat them. The N64 had no need for that sort of thing. As a kid, I was really frustrated by how many people professed this to be their favorite dungeon in the game because I had an outright horrible experience with it for the reasons mentioned earlier. If there's one convention I'm glad they largely abandoned after this game, it would be having easily missable keys that you would need 20 minutes later in a random door. That all aside, there are plenty of pluses too. The room rotating mechanic was a really cool one as far as puzzles go, and to this day is one of the best dungeon gimmicks they've thought up. Making it a haunted mansion was awesome too. I'm kinda impressed they thought to do that. If someone told me to make a forest temple, it'd probably look sorta boring, but these guys really struck gold with the look and feel of the place. I also love the strange Mario 64 feeling rooms, with the tiled floor textures, falling ceilings, spinning platforms, all that. While I don't have much respect for it from a game design perspective, the Forest Temple is creatively impressive and marginally less unpleasant than the Water Temple, earning it a spot above. From here out, I actually like the dungeons a lot. Let's get that out of the way. Weirdly enough, I don't see too much praise for the Fire Temple. It's got lots to love the way I see it. The Megaton Hammer, fire, tikis everywhere, and in the original edition of the game, affirmations of the glory of Allah. I guess the Gorons had to keep up morale somehow. Freeing all the Gorons sounds like a daunting concept for a dungeon, but it actually totally works. None of them are hidden in stupidly obscure places, so you can easily find them as you go through everything. I'm not quite sure who locked the Gorons in here, but we're talking about people who eat rocks and burn themselves alive for fun, so for all I know, they just got them with the old turkey leg on a rope trick. The fire mazes are fun set pieces that make navigation more interesting, and the rooms as a whole are much more interesting in layout than most other dungeons. It's deceptively vertical, which gives a lot of mileage to the awesome Megaton Hammer and its elevator creating prowess. The enemies are great in here, big fan of the flaming scarecrow guys, with the hookshot being the key to beating them and all. The way I see it, this temple is straight fire. The Fire Temple may not be loved, but the Shadow Temple seems to be outright hated by most people. The level of rage I see directed here is honestly baffling. What the hell did it do to these people? Fuck their mom? For starters, this is one of the coolest looking dungeons ever. It's got skulls galore and a horror aesthetic that remains unrivaled by any other dungeon to date in my opinion. The creativity here is incredible, not just visually but in the layout and puzzles as well. This is one of those rare cases in a Zelda game where a dungeon essentially has two items it's based around, in this case the Lens of Truth and the Hover Boots. Walking through walls and running over bottomless chasms is cool as hell, infinitely more so than blowing up rocks or hitting switches with nuts or whatever. You've also got interesting mechanics unique to the dungeon, like those goblin airman statues on the wall. I don't know, that's what I call them. I can't not mention the ghost ship either. Unlike a normal ship where you'd have to worry about rats, starvation, and syphilis, on this one you're contending with swords, shields, and maybe syphilis again, depending on what killed those two Stalfos. It's pretty easy, much like the mothers of Shadow Temple haters, but it's the spectacle that counts here. You know what else they have in here? Blood. Real legit bona fide blood. Nintendo really went all out back in the day. Unless you're playing the boring pussified version on the 3DS where they paid a janitor to swing by before Link shows up, in which case it loses a few cool points. Lots of vague but cool lore about Hyrule's bloody history, which seems to imply that the royal family used to be torturing prisoners of war in here. If it's torture they wanted, they would have been better off locking these guys in a room with that annoying bitch fucking owl, but hey, hindsight 2020. All in all, a very fun, creative dungeon that places among my favorites in the series as a whole, beaten out only by the one true masterpiece of a dungeon remaining. If you ask someone about the most iconic visual from Ocarina of Time, you'll get a lot of possible answers. Ganon's transformation at the very end, pulling the Master Sword from its sheath, or perhaps even the first time someone laid eyes on the Desert Colossus just outside the Spirit Temple. Well, for me it's watching those two pots levitate at you the moment you walk into the Spirit Temple. That is genuinely the first visual that shows up in my head when someone brings this game up to me. Something about the score for this dungeon really resonates with me and sells me on the setting as well. The power of sound design here is not to be ignored. Just talking about it brings back fond memories of sitting on my toilet watching music theory videos I didn't understand whatsoever about why everything Koji Kondo has ever composed makes Beethoven look like a moron by comparison. As well as the music, the aesthetic design absolutely nails that desert temple-y feel down to all the statues and sun iconography. It pulls a lot of inspiration from Zoroastrianism according to an article I read on ZeldaUniverse.net the other day, which lends a compelling sort of mysticism to everything in here. In terms of memorability, this dungeon doesn't just blow all the other dungeons out of the water, it bombards them with nuclear warheads and atomizes them into quantum vapor. It's the only dungeon you tackle as both Kid and Adult Link, meaning the puzzles are split up between the two kits, allowing for massive variety. The puzzles for both sides are solid, hard to pick a favorite. Adult Link gets to give the statue an amateur nipple piercing with a hookshot, so I guess he wins. It's kinda weird when Nabooru tells Kid Link she'd fuck him, but I suppose I'd rather be inside her guts than Jabu Jabu's if it came down to it. Ultimately, the Spirit Temple represents the Zelda series at its best, from cool design to entertaining gameplay, making it a no-brainer for the top spot in my eyes. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned for a boss ranking and coverage of the other games down the road, coming in the near future. Make sure to like and subscribe while you're at it. That's all for now. Deuces.